not personally, but has been a leader of an influencer of sport within London for quite a few years, and one person with great experience, Andy Sutch. His current role, chair of the London Federation, is also on the London Community Sports Board, and he also wears another hat, Andy, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the business of running sport, is that the correct title? So, business of sport and leisure. And also he was telling me before we started, he's very involved in the North Party parliamentary group. So as I would expect from Andy, knowing that he's been around for a while, involved in many levels, and he's our last speaker before we go into the panel discussion. So I invite Andy to the stadium or stage or podium, whatever we call it, but please carry on. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and good morning. And when Adrian telephoned me to say, would I like to say a few words, he said, you come as the chairman of the Federation of Sport in London and talk about sport from the community sector, particularly from the voluntary sector. But he also said, look, you're on last, so you've got a chance to say other things as well. And it's fair to say I have been involved in sport. I reckon now nearly 40 years in London. If I was thinking back that I actually played rugby at Saracens in 1971, very briefly in a junior team as a hooker when they were very short, and a friend of mine was playing scrum half the first. So it's about 40 odd years on. But I have been lucky, and I've worked in the public, the private and the voluntary sector. And what I want to try and do is take a slightly higher view of the Olympics and of events. I think there's a bit of history here, and try and find some of the lessons that we might have been learning. Because I think the formal legacies of the Games have been really well expanded by Emma. They're the matter of public record. I suppose what before I start, I'm really encouraged by a lot of what I've heard today, was some of the lessons I think tried to reach in this. I've heard expounded already in Enfield, already in education, and I know what the government executive are doing, and I'm encouraged by that. So there is a huge challenge, but I think some of the lessons as we see them are very relevant. There are four really key elements for me in any major event. And I want to look at the lessons we might have learned from the bidding process. And I was very lucky that for 2 years at Candidate City Stage, I was seconded to the bid part-time. So I saw some of that from inside. I can also say that I was very lucky that I'd actually been involved with earlier events bidding. So I've seen the events bidding stage in the past. The decision to bid, the philosophy and the nature of the bid, and I think we've already heard a lot about that, really well expounded in Singapore and in the bid document. The importance of the various strands of legacy, but particularly for us, the sporting strand. The staging the event, say no more, best ever, and I've seen a few Olympics. I think we're certainly passionate about it, but it probably was the best in terms of output of medals, performance, support for the volunteers, the whole thing. So we can't argue about that. And now we're looking at legacy. And I think in legacy there are a number of things. There are a number of levels where legacy is important, at local, strategic and national level. The nature of the legacy, the timing, and the success for those beneficiaries that legacy is aimed at. And for me that's clearly at the moment very much around the sporting community. If I can start with the bidding process, I was actually very lucky. I went to Barcelona in 1992, and for part of the time I was an accredited delegate there. I went there with the chairman of the then London Sports Council and the vice chairman. The chairman was an old Olympic medalist, well not old, but he had an Olympic medal from a previous Olympics. The vice chairman had been chairman of social services in one of the London boroughs, and therefore they had an interesting view of what the Olympic Games had to offer. And London had already had discussions really about bidding for the 2000 Olympic Games and the 2002 Commonwealth Games. And it's interesting that that discussion very much focused around what will be the legacy for London. Now there was clearly a very important hard legacy. London hadn't really built a major sports facility since Crystal Palace in 1964. You know, football clubs had done it, cricket, but there wasn't a major sports facility built in London. For the capital city, it was an appalling situation. And so whatever else we can say, we've got from this Olympic Games in Olympic Park and around London some fantastic legacy facilities in terms of competition and training facilities, and much lower level. We've got, was it 23 beach volleyball courts around London now. We've got a number of pools, temporary pools, going into facilities. So the facility bit, I'm not going to touch much on today. But we thought about making that a bid. London made 2 bids. London made a bid for the 2000 Olympic Games and a bid for the 2002 Commonwealth Games. And it's interesting, but both of those bids failed. They were underfunded, or privately funded effectively, rather than the huge amount pushed in by someone like Manchester at the time. On the other hand, they failed really for a fundamental reason, I think, and it was brought home to me a couple of years later when I was in Barcelona speaking at a conference, and I sat next to the Deputy Mayor of Barcelona, who explained to me how critical the role of the political leadership in Barcelona had been in driving that city to make its bid for the Olympics. There was a lot of rivalry with Madrid, but it was the political leadership that brought Barcelona to the fore and brought that Games to fruition. And it was very clear to me that we hadn't got, at that time in London, that political leadership anywhere. So the decision to bid was always going to be made in a very difficult set of circumstances. But luckily, a couple of years on, the commercial sector came together in London through London First, began to add some weight to the idea of bidding for the Olympics in 2012. We then had the election of a London mayor, which has already been referred to. We then had some political drive to go for a bid. And in many ways, I think it's those 3 things coming together. The initial thoughts around legacy from the regional council and the voluntary sector, the commitment of the private sector through London First, and then the election of a London mayor to give political focus that helped very much indeed. So we got a bid. We get to the first stage, candidate city stage, and that's the stage I know most about, because I had 2 days a week working on it. I think there were a number of things that happened there. The thing that most impressed me, perhaps, is the way, certainly in London, what is a hugely disparate sports agenda of organisations was brought together. Somebody once described sport in this country like an electrical wiring diagram, and that's probably been kind to it. It's a very cumbersome process here. And what happened during that period of bidding is those organisations came together, they worked together, and they produced a common front and a common bid. And there was engagement. There was huge engagement, I think, from the voluntary sector. One of the things, actually, that helped that was that initial candidate city logo. I saw it on one of the earlier slides. It reminded me what I thought, what a very good logo that was. And interestingly, not just was it a good logo for London, but it was accessible and available. No licensing, no branding, no requirement to get consent to use it. I know that we had a very small grants programme in the Federation, helped by London Council, or its forerunner. We had, I think, 200 major events that summer in the voluntary sector, every single one branded with Candidate City badge. In my day job, I have Welcome Break as one of my members. Every single motorway service centre up the motorways of Britain was wearing that Candidate City badge on the front desk. Now, it was an accessible way of getting engagement in the community. And I think that's one of the strengths of the bidding process that we had at that stage. And for me, that's a key lesson to learn. The government clearly were committed by then, and so the need to drive that at that level was no longer crucial. The bid itself, the bid document and the presentation in Singapore are a matter of public record. The bid had become a very sound technical document, and it dealt with those earlier issues such as transportation, and it highlighted many of the likely economic and social benefits. However, there was a key emphasis in the bid document and the presentation on both domestic and an international level of lasting sporting legacy, and I believe that was one of the things that made the difference. But what the bid document and the bid itself failed to spell out was the process for the delivery of that legacy in the community, at domestic level. International level, absolutely worked well. Inspiration abroad, wonderful process, and actually successful, and set out from a very early stage. What was missing in the bid document and the immediate period after the bid was won was any real responsibility for delivering legacy. Lots of people grasped the nettle. Lots of individual sports governing bodies did extremely well. They picked up the opportunity. I think badminton's in the room somewhere. They picked up over time the opportunity to use the Olympics and produce programmes that delivered from that. Much more difficult to get a coordinated legacy out of a multi-sport event than it is for an individual governing body or an individual sport to develop a legacy programme for its own event, for its own sport. So I think one of the learning curves for me is that multi-sport events, the legacy delivery, needs to be thought out much earlier, not in the period after you've won the event, but well beforehand. So define and identify responsibility at a very early stage. Legacy benefits. I'm conscious of time, so I'll run through this very quickly, but I think there are a number of benefits. For me, by far the biggest benefit is the emerging coordination for sport in London. You've heard reference to the role of the Mayor all the way through. We've now got a London Community Sports Board. It's still in its infancy, but it's interesting, when the government was looking at legacy planning, one of the few documents, if I remember rightly, that got a green light from government was in fact the work the board had done on its first strategy. It had looked at legacy on a London-wide basis. It had seen the need to connect that to local delivery, and that's what that early document did. So I think the engagement of the Mayor and the board is important. Sport England, London councils, the Football Foundation, London Marathon Trust, the Federation are all working much more closely together than ever before. We've not solved the answer, but it's a lot more close working. There are still issues around timetabling for grant applications. There are still different kinds of criteria for grant applications. But at least we've got a number of bodies who are talking to each other, comparing notes, and having a sense of priority to make sure we get the best investment in London. If you want, my ideal solution would be a simple single letterbox that says London Grants on it. Everyone puts their application through the front letterbox, and the work is done behind with the sum of money behind the table. That's a long way off, but that's an aspiration for me. We've heard about education, FE and HE, and I won't go over that again. Can I pick up, though, the issue of financial threats and opportunities? I'm actually hugely encouraged by some of the Sport England grant programmes, by People, Places and Play. I was lucky, I went to the launch of the 1000 Inspire project down in South London about 6 weeks ago. That's a grant programme that's recognised the needs of community sport. It's not just a new initiative, but it's saying we've got in the community sector some sustainable sport, often supported predominantly by voluntary activity, with a small amount of local authority and statutory funding, but it's struggling. It's struggling to meet the needs of its existing members, never mind grow the membership, which has always been the aspiration of the past. This programme says, how can we help to sustain those organisations? It's money for things that are actually needed to keep sport delivering in London. So I'm a huge advocate of that. We've touched on £150 million for primary schools. I was interested about the reference to not being able to contact clubs. Because in fact, if we look at the last 10 years of Youth Sport Trust mandate on sport in schools and school club links, a key part for 10 years of that mandate was to generate club links in school. Now, if it's not been happening, you have to question why. Clearly, it's difficult for clubs in the voluntary sector if they can only contact a school during the working day, because most of them are volunteers. But I think that failure, if it's failed for 10 years, means we really do have to revisit that school club link programme. And I'm quite encouraged by Sport England's new announcement about satellite programmes, where you genuinely build that link between school, club, with an intermediary somewhere that's delivering what's needed. Local government and leisure budget absolutely concur with the points that have been made. There is a huge, huge threat there. Whether it goes down to zero funding in 2020, which I think the local government associations kind of doom and gloom forecasters, I don't know. But we are already beginning to see the emergence of that, not just in today's Guardian, but I chair a local sports council in South West London. And we've had across London a series of events like this at local level, looking at sport in post-Olympic London. And one of the things that's emerging immediately is partly because of the pressure on local government funding, partly because of the change in the way the rates are being dealt with locally, is that rate relief that was discretionary is being taken away. And earlier on we heard about the Sport and Recreation Alliance survey of clubs, and it's quite true. 2/3 of those clubs are seeing growth. And most of them actually would like to see more growth if they had more resources in terms of coaches and facility capacity. But at the same time, there are a number of voluntary clubs in London who face regularly, at best break even, or at worst slight loss on their financial budget each year. But very often they're getting through that year with rate relief of the order of £2,000, £3,000, £4,000. Now, if in post-Olympic years we suddenly impose a rate burden on those clubs of £2,000, £3,000 or £4,000, we could see 40% of the clubs in London suddenly going from a positive balance sheet to a negative balance sheet. So I think there's a real issue, not just in terms of direct funding from the local authorities and direct support for sport from the local authorities, but the loss of the indirect support through rate relief. Now, we always say in the past a club could generate that rate relief by becoming a CASC, a community amateur sports club, and registering. Little writing in the budget this year, let's review CASCs, let's review their conditions. So we're getting hit potentially by changes in the rating system, pressure on local government funding, and is the government going to take away some of the CASC opportunity? So there is a real financial threat. But one of the opportunities must be the opportunity to access this new, experienced and incredibly positive volunteer labour force. Whether it's games makers, whether it's ambassadors, whether it's some of those people who've worked part-time on the games. I know for a while there was a database of people who'd worked part-time on the games who hadn't got back into work. I think that's been now finished, unfortunately. But access to those, that volunteer labour force is crucial. We recently had a federation evening giving out awards for volunteering, which Kate Hoey kindly did, and I think we had 25 recipients of awards that night. The youngest person had done 25 years of volunteering. The oldest person had done 50 years of volunteering. And if you added up the number of years those volunteers had done, it was astronomical. But we've got to make sure those volunteers are replaced, because the community sport model in this country needs volunteers. And without them, it'll collapse. So on the one hand, pressure on local government finance and statutory finance. We've got increasing pressure on the clubs from a number of areas. We need those voluntary sector workers, voluntary sector supporters to deliver. So I suppose I would say there are two keys to making a sustainable change for benefit in London. I do think the coordination of sport in London is essential. I think strategic leadership, whether it's by the Mayor, the Sports Board, and the London model, which we can learn a lot from what happened in Barcelona in 1992. That strategic leadership is crucial, but we have to keep connectivity to the community. I think today is a very good example of that. We've got a huge amount of community sport representatives in a room together discussing the way forward. So it must balance strategic leadership and connectivity at a local level. And secondly, the volunteer base from games makers, ambassadors and those with other temporary experience. We've got to hold on to them, we've got to make them feel valued, we've got to be able to make sure they can access the clubs They want to work with all the organisations. It doesn't have to be a sports club. Sometimes you can take that energy into another organisation and still deliver. So I think, for me, those are the two things we can probably change. I have a nasty feeling we can't do much about the financial situation. Local government finances are going to be under pressure. But we might, just might, think about one or two more innovative areas. And I thought I'd just throw in two. One of them for me is the idea of, the government's just said it might increase the age group to 12 for vouchers for nursery education. Now, I like the idea of vouchers to help young people up to the age of 12, particularly because for my sins I also sat on the NICE Commission on Obesity recently. Some people unfairly said I was there as a guinea pig. But what worried me is I was one of the very few people there with any kind of exercise background who were predominantly medical staff or nutritionists. So the point's well made. Exercise doesn't always get as much of its help as it might. But I'd love to see a situation whereby, through salary sacrifice, through some tax benefit, for up to the age of 12, we could have a voucher system that could pay your junior sports club membership, could buy that expensive pair of boots that a kid needs to play football, as a way of saying, let's take some of the pressure off. The cost of treasury, relatively small. The opportunity in terms of dealing with a long-term obesity risk, potentially very big. And the other one, which I threatened Adrian with raising, is about aspiration. We had a debate in my day job recently where we've tried to persuade government that when they're looking at planning for sport, we've historically taken lots of data, often participation rates that are based historically. And we tend to say, if you've got a 6% participation rate in football, and there are this 1,000 people in your area in that age group, that's the amount of playing field provision you need. Historically, it used to be 2 sports centres at 40,000 people. Now, that's fine. I live in southwest London. We're getting over 42% people playing, doing exercise once a week. I know in parts of East London, that drops something like 23, 24%. Now, why is that? How do we change that? The only way we change it is having a real aspiration to change it. So we don't plan in future just for the base level. We begin to say, and we have a little bit in playing field areas, we've always said there's latent demand for football, cricket, rugby and so on. So we often say, well, where's the highest level of participation? And it might be in somewhere like Kingston or Surbiton. And we apply that level of planning to playing field provision in the future. I think we're going to break that mould and begin to have real aspirational planning. We want to change these 36, 37% once a week to 40, 50, 60, 70%. Now, we're not going to do it overnight, but if we don't put the planning aspiration there in the next few months, then we'll build into the planning cycle something which is staid, not fit for purpose, and not going to break the mould. So my real plea, my two pleas that aren't on here, one is for a tax break for 0 to 12s, or to parents, and two is let's change our approach to planning, and we've got a chance to do it. The old planning policy guidance has been dropped. We've got to replace it, and let's use aspirational planning as the way forward. We first used this about 6 weeks ago, and I'm quite pleased the government now talks about aspirational government on occasions. So for me, those are some of the things we've learned. Sorry I've gone over, but thanks very much indeed.
Well, thanks, Andy. That was exactly how we wanted to leave it, with some good asks of government. Probably unfair for her to ask Emma to make an ask of government, but while Emma's in the room, we can make some asks of government. So, and don't worry, Andy, you weren't the only one who ran over time, so we're all over time. So Adrian and his staff are putting the chairs out, so I'll invite the keynote speakers to come forward. I'm looking to Adrian for guidance on how long we've got.
Yeah, about 15 minutes.
So we've got 15 minutes of time for people in the audience who sat there and patiently hopefully inspirationally, or been inspired by the keynote speakers. There's been some, fascinating canter from government to, sharp-end education to borough provision and, the challenges of that date. And Andy, I think, has summarised the whole picture very, very nicely, and actually that was a good flow through the presentations. So here's the moment that someone like me dreads, is when you say over to the audience and you expect a forest of hands to go up, and then there's a bit of a silence. But I know a few people in the audience, and I know that they're not exactly bashful. So, yeah, it's exactly it.
I've got a question.
The first question. So, just a couple of rules. Say who you are, where you're from, and also, if you can, who the question's directed to. But if it's to everybody, that's fine as well.
Alex Welsh, London Playing Fields Foundation. My question is about shouting. No, my question is about facilities and evoking what Gordon said earlier about changing under a motorway flyover. We talk about iconic facilities, and in London we're a great sporting city. If you think of tennis, you think of Wimbledon. If you think of rugby, you think of Twickenham. If you think of cricket, you think of Lord's. And if you think of football, you think of Wembley. So why have we lost 40% of our grass cricket wickets over the last 20 years? Why have we lost 20% of our football pitches? And if we are to widen, increase and sustain participation, surely, to use a literature phrase, Doug, we need accessible, affordable, attractive facilities to play on. So we welcome the 135 million for the people who places played, but there's been 400 million lost to grassroots sports in 2005. In 2005, there was 60 million from the Football Foundation. Now there's less than 30 million. So what are we going to do to modernise these facilities, and what are we going to do then to make sure they're managed and maintained properly?